Okay.
Sorry.
Cassie, if you could also just put that one more time, that'd be great.
Yes, I will do that.
Alrighty, so with that being said, then we're just gonna hop right into our event for today.
So a schedule of tonight is we want to give you a quick presentation on the tips and tricks of networking. And then our big bulk of our workshop is going to be practicing with each other in one-on-one breakout rooms. And then at the end, we want to practice some recruiting roles and scenes like that, but we will explain that a little more at the end.
All right, so to start us off, I think an important thing to go over is that networking is really a conversation. So it's important, like with any other conversation, when you're talking to another person, you have to try your best to make sure you're listening to what the other person is saying and actively responding to what they're talking about. As with anything, you don't really want a one-sided conversation, as that can sometimes get awkward. So to avoid that, it's like with any conversation, make sure we're talking to the other person and actively responding to what they're talking about. In a networking specific context, sometimes it's good to also make sure you have a couple main points in mind that you would like to address. This can be anything from your professional interest to your past experiences, or even when you're having a conversation with another person, be it the recruiter or a group of people. If you find any common interests, that could also be another great thing to talk about. The main point is that you don't want to go into a networking event with the only goal being that you want to walk away with a job or internship. Recruiters have mentioned that these types of conversations where you kind of come in with just that goal in mind can be not the most positive impression, because it kind of gives the idea that you're only there to get something out of it. And remember, in a conversation, you wouldn't normally want to get something out of it. So same thing would kind of apply to a networking context as well. So at the end of the day, you're just trying to get to know the other person. So that's important to keep in mind.
Now, most conversations normally start with, "Hi, how are you?" And networking is just the same. But it's important to remember that this is a very substantial question. Most recruiters do actually remember you and your interests better if you actually give them an answer besides, "I'm good." Because I know most of us want to just say, "I'm good," and go straight into our elevator pitch or progress the conversation. But if you take the time to answer this with something even as simple as, "Oh, I just finished the book, this book about X, Y, and Z," it makes you more personal and a recruiter will tend to remember you more.
So on that note, it's really important to make sure we're trying our best to stay engaged in a conversation. And the easiest way to accomplish that is making sure you're responding to prompts actively. As an example, one of the most common questions that you might be asked across different networking events is the dreaded "tell me a little bit about yourself," because it can be a very open-ended question. However, there are a couple ways you can address this question that'll give the recruiter something to remember you by. So you could start by saying something like, "I'm a junior studying philosophy." While this does answer the question, it kind of stops there. There's not much that the recruiter or the other person you're talking to can really follow up on, other than the fact that they could say, "Cool, philosophy." And that's about it. So we want to make sure we're trying to prompt a conversation past that point. So this would be like an average response. Another response would be, "I'm currently a junior and I'm majoring in philosophy. My main focus is rationalism." In this answer, you've already kind of taken that same context of the question and kind of added a little bit more. You've not only given them your academic interests, you kind of give a little bit more about what specifically interests you in that field of study, and that can allow the recruiter to ask you more follow-up questions about something in particular, maybe about, let's say, rationalism and your opinions on it. So this would be a pretty good response. And if we're going to go all the way to the final level, we could say something along the lines of, "I'm a junior studying philosophy at UCLA, and I'm particularly interested in the rationalism school of thought. I've actually been researching this topic and its implications in daily life." Here, you've kind of given as much content as you possibly can, because you've talked not only about your academic interests and things like that, but you've also followed it up with a concrete example about ways you're actively pursuing that. And this is a really great conversation starter, because the recruiter would be able to ask you about your research or something that you're doing. And that's kind of just a general guideline to be a little bit more, you want to make sure that the way you're responding to prompts is in a way that you can actually be followed up about it. And our final pro tip about this is to try and get the other person to talk about themselves. As much as we want to talk about ourselves, they probably want something to share about their interests and something that they've been working on as well. As with any conversation, like we said, you don't want it to be one-sided. So if you can start with something as simple as asking how their day was, that's a great place to start. Or if they mention something that's interesting to you, actively follow up on it. And as at the end of the day, we want to make sure that as much as you're trying to stay engaged, they are able to do the exact same.
And when you've come to the end of your conversation, you always want to ask for their contact information, be that with email or LinkedIn or any other form that they are willing to share with you. And you also want to thank them for their time. It's not required that they have a conversation with you, so you want to be appreciative that they took the time to start the conversation and are willing to build a relationship with you. After that, you should probably follow up, either messaging them on LinkedIn or emailing them, and then you also want to stay in touch for the months and maybe years to come. And this is great because it builds upon the conversation that you had, and it makes it much easier to get an internship if you are looking for one later in life. And then a pro tip is that once you finish your conversation, it's good to write down what you guys talked about and maybe something about them, so that when you do follow up, you can add that little personal touch and remind them that you had a conversation with them.
And then finally, one of the hardest things about networking events is honestly trying to combat some nerves. And there are a couple of things you can do beforehand to make yourself feel more confident walking into that room. First things first, it's always a good idea to be prepared. Doing your research potentially on the companies that are attending the event or the recruiters in particular will always help you feel a little bit more confident walking into the room, as opposed to somebody who may walk into the room and ask, what is this company about? So we want to avoid that, because also recruiters don't want to have to talk about their company like 7 different times. So to avoid that, it's always a good idea to do a little bit of research beforehand. Another thing to note is sometimes you just got to be your own cheerleader. Remind yourself that you can do it. So taking maybe a second to power pose in the mirror, if that's what it takes, and it helps you get more confident, you should definitely do it. And then finally, when you're actually having the conversations, it's always important to be yourself. It sounds a little cliche, but with any conversation, it's a lot more tiring to answer questions in a way that you would think the other person wants to hear the response, as opposed to the way that you want to answer the questions. And that'll give a greater insight into your genuine self, as opposed to maybe some version or kind of answers that you didn't necessarily you aren't necessarily passionate about. So be yourself.
And then we're super hopeful that we'll be in person next year. And since we've spent the whole year virtually networking, we wanted to give you guys a little bit of a reminder of what in-person networking would be like. So first off, you definitely want to dress professionally. So you want to err on the side of a little more formal, which would be a blazer, a tie, or a collared shirt. Professional attire sets a good impression that you are prepared to be there. You definitely want to project your voice. It's a kind of awkward when the representative has to ask you to repeat yourself. And in the in-person networking, the room is generally loud, so it's better just to project yourself. You want to start with a firm handshake, which you can do by practicing with your roommate or a family member, or even a pet if you have one, but please be gentle with your pets. You also want to maintain eye contact throughout the conversation. It shows that you're engage in the conversation and you would like to learn about them and be there. And make sure you have a hard copy of your resume and so that you can give it to the recruiter or who you're talking to. So it would be good to have several copies if you plan on talking to more than one person.
All right, so that kind of brings us to the end of our side of the presentation. Hopefully you got some insights there. And we're gonna just take a second to pause. If you have any questions, feel free to either raise your hand or drop them in the chat.
I had a question. In general, what type of networking events would you say that it's appropriate to bring your resume to, and which ones should you not?
Yes, I would say larger networking events when you're talking to recruiters or even professors that you would like to have research from, or anyone who would benefit from having your resume. I would say if you're just networking with peers, you don't really need to have one for that. But yeah, something of those type of events.
I had a question. So in your example about like, tell me more about yourself, and the example was like, I'm a junior who's interested in like studying philosophy, who's interested in rationalism or something like that. What are some examples you have for like topics we could say are like of personal interest in like the engineering majors?
Yeah, so I think kind of along that line, you could kind of follow it up with, as opposed to in that final example where we talked about like the specific example and a concrete way that you're following up that academic interest. That's a kind of a great way to talk about any club involvement or research projects that you're involved in that are specific to a key area of the engineering field that you are passionate about. So that can translate over pretty well as well into something kind of along those lines, because basically when you're answering like a tell me about yourself, you don't want to stop at just your major. You want to give them a little bit more context about what specifically in your major you enjoy, or like what are the organizations you're a part of that you are passionate about as well. So something kind of along those lines.
I had another question too. So especially when like contacting recruiters on LinkedIn, like most probably like recruiters don't like really answer. So is there like a way to like make messages more like personalized and like maybe more relatable to like recruiters, especially like on LinkedIn, like not in real life?
I would say if you have talked to them, again, try to write something down in your message that is particular to what you've talked about. But if you're just cold messaging them, I would suggest stalking them first and checking out their LinkedIn. If they have a particular thing marked off, like if they also are a SWE member, that may be something you want to address in your message, or if they just have anything else that you can connect to, it'll add that little personal touch too.
Thank you.
I think that brings us to the end of the questions for now. If any others come up throughout the night, please feel free to send them into the chat, and we will try our best to address all of them. So now we're going to move into kind of the practice part of the event. So just to let you know, we're going to have breakout rooms with conversations happening one-on-one. And they're going to be roughly 5 minutes, maybe a little bit less. So you can kind of expect that time frame. And we're going to have a couple sets of prompts to go through. So let's start off with the first one. So our first prompt is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? You can use this kind of just to guide your conversation and just try and use some of the tips that we were mentioning in the beginning of our presentation. All right, and Cassidy, are we good to go in breakout rooms?
Yes, one moment. I'm sending the question in the chat just so that everyone can see it while they're in the breakout rooms, and I will